Hello, this is the personality known as Jules. This is a more advanced video, so I've included links to the Start Here and Glossary playlists in the description box below for ease of access should you want explanations of any of the terms or concepts that I use in it. In my video titled, Is Consciousness Progression Exponential?, I intimated that humanity might be hitting yellow stage right about now. But how could that be possible? Looking around, I certainly don't feel like I'm seeing a lot of people in Tier 2, and even if it were possible, is there any way to test whether or not it's actually happening? This video is going to take a crack at answering those questions. If this sort of thing intrigues you, consider hitting the subscribe button if you haven't yet, and listen on. First, could it even be possible that humanity is starting to experience yellow stage now? I see two obvious objections. Objection 1. Even if humanity has already hit green stage, and that's a big if, we would have gotten there, in the 60s at the earliest? That's a couple of 100 years after the Age of Enlightenment, which is apparently when Europe got to orange stage, according to the original Spiral Dynamics book. So how could we be getting to yellow stage only a few decades after green? My answer to this objection is in the video I just mentioned, Is Consciousness Progression Exponential? I'll put a link to that video in the description box too. Objection 2. Looking around, it seems pretty clear that a vast majority of people are still in Tier 1, even in the most culturally advanced nations in the world. How could humanity at large already be shifting into yellow stage while most of its members are still in Tier 1? On the surface of it, this notion sounds ridiculous. To address this second objection, let me begin by clarifying what I mean when I suggest that humanity might be starting a stage of consciousness. When I'm talking generally about spiral dynamics stage of any group of people, a team, an organization, a country, all of humanity, I'm usually talking about the stage of the values, language, beliefs, etc. of their culture, not necessarily about the stage of any specific individuals in it. But wait, how could a culture be ahead of its members? Here's what I see. 1. An individual person can have different developmental lines located in different stages of consciousness development. Some of those lines are likely to be behind their current center of gravity, and some of them are probably ahead. So a person who is currently centered in green stage can easily have one or more developmental lines already reaching ahead into yellow stage. 2. A culture is a conglomeration of influences from the people who participate in it, whatever influences happen to catch on. And the influences that catch on are probably not all from one person. 3. Influences from stages that are further along tend to have a magnetism to them, such that people will often start picking up language, behaviors, etc. from more advanced stages before they fully understand them. Think, for example, of CEOs in orange stage trying to increase the racial and gender diversity of their companies to increase their market access. 4. So, you can easily have people who themselves are centered in green stage, but who each have a few developmental lines reaching ahead into yellow stage, contributing yellow stage influences to their culture. These yellow stage influences would tend to be magnetic, and would therefore have a high likelihood of catching on. 5. Thus, because of the magnetism of the influences of more advanced stages, you don't actually need to have any individual people centered in yellow stage in order for a culture to start acquiring yellow stage features. And then, of course, as individual members of the culture genuinely shift their center of gravity into yellow stage, that influence only becomes more prevalent. And finally, when referring to a culture, what am I defining as the starting point of a stage? What do I mean when I'm talking about humanity having reached a particular stage? I'm specifically talking about a tipping point, where prior to that point, any influences from that stage in question were sparse and didn't seem to have much effect on the general culture. But after that tipping point, there's a dramatic increase in the adoption of influences from that stage. So, given the observations I just described, I think it's absolutely possible for us to have globally reached a cultural tipping point into yellow stage, even if the vast majority of us are still in Tier 1. The next question is, have we? Is there a way to actually determine the cultural tipping point of a stage of consciousness? I think there might be. Here's my reasoning. Our states and stages of consciousness affect what we think about. What we think about is what we end up communicating about. What we try to communicate affects the language we use. So, we should be able to see a culture's stage of consciousness revealed in its uses of language. English is the current global lingua franca, so its global usage patterns should reveal significant information about recent global consciousness shifts. Therefore, if humanity has already reached a cultural tipping point into yellow stage, we should be seeing a recent significant increase in the frequency of particularly yellow stage words and phrases in English around the world. Here's my proposed method. Google Books Ngram Viewer provides graphs of word frequencies in books published from the year 1500 to the year 2022. For each word that you input, it displays a graph of the percentage frequency of that word compared to other words in books published over the time period you select, in language that you select, which in this case is English. So, if the graph for a word increases, that indicates that the word became more popular over time. Why do we care that it's the percentage frequency of words instead of pure word counts? In the 16th century, the approximate number of books published in English was 75,000 to 100,000 unique books. At the time, the average number of words per English language book was 25,000 to 35,000 words per book. So, multiplying those numbers together, the approximate total number of words published in English in the 16th century was 1.9 to 3.5 billion words. In the 20th century, however, the approximate number of unique titles published in English was 25 to 35 million unique books. Books had become thicker, too. The average number of words per English language book was 75,000 to 85,000 words per book. So the approximate number of total words published in English in the 20th century was 2 to 3 quadrillion words. This means that all of the English words published in the 16th century would constitute only 0.0001% of all the words published in the 20th century. That's why we're paying attention to what percentage of published words a given word constitutes in each year, rather than just looking at word counts. If we simply counted how many times a word showed up in the 16th century versus how many times that word showed up in the 20th century, the 16th century usage wouldn't even show up on the graph, no matter how popular it was. Also, it's worth noting the limitations of the data we're looking at. For example, the data is going to be noisier and more difficult to read the earlier we go in the timeline. Noisy data means that the data has lots of extreme jumps up and down. When the graph is really jumpy like that, it can be difficult to see what the overall shape of the graph is. For example, let's look at the word advertise. You can see these extreme jumps up and down in the 16th century. It's really difficult to figure out what the shape of the graph is supposed to be in the 16th century here. Was the word popular or not? The reason why this data in the 16th century is noisy is because the whole data set is smaller. Fewer total words were published in English. So even if a word is used sporadically here and there, it's still going to show up in this data and throw off the overall shape of the graph. These jumps go way up and then immediately way back down. The word was being used in the 16th century, maybe by a few authors here and there, but the jumpiness of this data makes me suspicious that this word was actually in as widespread use in the 1570s as it was over here in the 1920s. And actually, you can see from these blocky shapes here and there that there's some smoothing being applied. That's when values on either side are getting averaged together. Let's change the smoothing to 0. Wow, yeah. There's no way that the word advertise was generally more popular in 1574 than it was in 1920. I'm going to change it to 3, the default smoothing, so we can look at the rest of the graph. After the 16th century, you can see the graph become a little more comprehensible in the 17th and 18th centuries. More books were being published, so a word randomly being used here and there is not going to disrupt the overall data as much. You can now see the rough shape of the graph, and you can see what's going on. There was apparently a big jump in the frequency of this word in the 1630s, and then this increase stays up for a while. So that looks more like the word genuinely became more popular in the 1630s and 40s. But this graph still has lots of jaggedy ups and downs here. And then by the 20th century, you can see the graph really smooth out. Now, lots of books are being published in English all over the world, so random anomalies get lost in the sea of words. That means that what we're looking at here in the 20th century is a much clearer indication of how widespread the usage of this word really was. Now, you can smooth out the graph more to see the shape more clearly in the jumpy bits, but I want you to watch what happens at both ends of the graph when I do this. You'll see the earlier part of the graph smooth out, so you can see the shape better. But details like this increase in the 90s are going to disappear. So the smoothing was at 3. Let's increase that to 20. See, that increase in the 90s has already disappeared. And the data in the 16th century is still pretty ragged. But we can now see that this word was not as popular in the 16th century as it was in the mid-17th century. And we can still see the clear jump in the early 17th century. If we increase the smoothing all the way to 50, now we've even lost that clear jump in the early 17th century. It's become just this little blip, which would be easy to miss. So yeah, it can take some practice to get good at reading graphs of real data. But I'm going to do my best in this video to select words that have well-behaved graphs and to appropriately adjust their timescales and magnitudes so that you can clearly see what's going on. I'm going to use the default smoothing of 3 throughout. But if you happen to want to do this research for yourself, either just for fun or to check my work. I'm also going to describe exactly what I did, and I'll provide a link in the description to my original brainstorm lists of all the words and phrases that I started with, as well as how I categorized these words and phrases in each culling step that I put them through. My criteria for brainstorming words and phrases for a stage were words that people might not use very often prior to that stage, but that they would tend to use frequently once they got into that stage. My steps for culling the brainstorm list: to select sets of keywords and phrases to represent the cultural tipping point of a stage were: step 1, remove neologisms, new words that were coined too recently before the stage shift to be able to use them to clearly see the stage emerge. I'm looking for significant increases in word frequencies. Neologisms would be a different experiment. Step 2, select words that have a clear, steep increase. And then the stage doesn't come on all at once. Some influences come on earlier than others. So step 3 is to identify the clusters of words that increased in different time periods, and then select the densest cluster to represent the specific time period when that stage really started to take off. The result of this step gives the time period of the cultural tipping point. Step 4, prioritize words for broader concepts and concepts that are more core to the target stage. Step 5, select a representative handful of words that are relatively varied in the concepts that they refer to. The resulting words and phrases are what I graph together to see what that stage's cultural tipping point looks like, assuming it has one. But before I apply this method to yellow stage, I first want to confirm that it actually works. So let's backtest it on orange and green stages. What should we expect to see if this method works? Well, in the original Spiral Dynamics book, Don Beck and Christopher Cohen identified the Age of Enlightenment as marking the cultural beginning of Orange Stage in European history around the 18th century or so. And Ken Wilber, who collaborated with Don Beck for several years, identified the 1960s counterculture movement as indicating the global cultural onset of Green Stage. So, if this method works, and assuming Ben, Cohen, and Wilber were correct, then we should see Orange Stage words become dramatically more popular at some point during the Age of Enlightenment, and Green Stage words become more popular at some point around the 1960s. Let's start by looking at Orange Stage. Note, English didn't really become the global lingua franca until the 20th century. So prior to the 20th century, we're talking about the culture of the English-speaking world, not global culture. The vast majority of English language books in the 18th century were published in Great Britain and Ireland. So the data we're looking at in English for the Orange Stage tipping point would be predominantly from there. The Age of Enlightenment for Great Britain and Ireland was approximately from the late 17th century through the 18th century. So if our method works, we should see a significant increase in the relative frequency of Orange Stage words and phrases at some point during this period. These are the words I selected using the brainstorming and culling methods I just described for Orange Stage to demonstrate the clear tipping point: logic, mathematics, university, idea, currency. I'm going to add multipliers so we can view the graphs together because the magnitudes of the words vary. And no, the overall magnitudes of the graphs don't matter here because what I'm looking at is how the frequency of a word changes over time relative to its own history. I'm not comparing the magnitudes of these words directly with each other. So here's the graph of mathematics, currency, idea, logic, university. These words sound so normal to us now, but look at how rare they used to be. So the tipping point time range I'm looking for is that ambiguous phase after the clear phase of plateau and before the clear rapid increase. That's the phase I'm defining as the cultural tipping point, or start, or onset, leading edge, etc., of a stage. So it looks like the cultural tipping point for Orange Stage in Great Britain and Ireland was from the 1710s to the 1730s, which was during the first half of the Age of Enlightenment there, confirming the estimate given by Don Beck and Christopher Cohen. Note, I'm less concerned in this video with what happens after the initial increase. I'm looking for a moment of significant increase in the frequencies of certain words to demonstrate the leading edge of when a culture starts being influenced by a certain stage of consciousness. That said, the subsequent patterns do tell their own fascinating story. After the initial increase, a graph can find an equilibrium and more or less plateau, eventually decrease as ideas from subsequent stages take hold, get an even further bump as the word gets discussed or used by subsequent stages, or have a conniption fit. But the emergence of a stage isn't always easy and straightforward. Orange Stage had some false starts. Let's look at another set of core Orange Stage words. Success, freedom, progress, happiness. First, note the distinct tenor of these words. These are all the values of Orange Stage, the why behind it. And then look at where they first emerge. Nearly a century before Orange Stage really took off. These ideas caused this stage. They were the spark that ignited it. So let's watch the story they tell. Here you can see Orange Stage begin to emerge, then get thoroughly stomped on by Blue Stage antibodies as it senses the emerging threat, and then finally burst forth full force. Here, let's show a couple of Blue Stage words from this culture for contrast. Church with a capital C, and Jesus. The words from the two different stages appear to have an almost inverse relationship. Here's Blue Stage fighting for its life, and it looks like it's about to win. But then Orange Stage takes off, and Blue Stage recedes into the background. But notice that they both sort of plateau for a while after that. Blue Stage never completely disappears. This is an important thing to remember about consciousness progression. The earlier stages never disappear completely. And Orange Stage doesn't just keep going up forever. It can't. because at some point, we begin to move on to green stage. These are the words that I picked for green stage. Ecosystem, racism, feminist, collaborative, sexuality. And here is a clear cultural onset of green stage demonstrated in the 1960s, which corroborates Ken Wilber's estimate. So did the method work? Looks like it. Now that we've backtested this method and have reasonable confidence that it works, let's finally test it on yellow stage. Here's the list of words and phrases that I picked to demonstrate the onset of yellow stage. Thank you to the other consciousness pioneers who helped me brainstorm for yellow stage. Meta, systems thinking, authentic self, theory of everything, sustainability. I had one person question my placing of this particular word in yellow stage as opposed to green stage. The way I see it, it is a yellow stage version of the green stage concern for the environment and the future. The concept of sustainability, unlike environmentalism, holism, organic farming, etc., inherently contains within it a systems thinking perspective. In order for something to be considered sustainable, you have to be considering how it interacts with multiple systems. The capacity to think this way comes on in yellow. That said, as this yellow stage notion has influenced our culture, green stage has started using it without fully understanding it. Remember the example I gave of orange stage business people trying to implement diverse hiring practices without fully understanding why or possibly even how to do that? This is the same phenomenon, but with green stage trying to use a yellow stage concept. When you see something like that, earlier stages co-opting, misinterpreting, and/or misusing concepts from later stages, that's a dead giveaway that the later stages are influencing the culture at large. Oh, and regarding the word meta in particular, I know Facebook Inc. recently changed its name to Meta. Very savvy of them. So I would want to see a significant increase in the use of the word meta before they announced their name change on October 28th, 2021. Let's look at meta by itself to check this. It looks like we hit a hockey stick moment for the word meta about 30 to 40 years before Facebook Inc. changed its name, so we're safe on that front. So do all these words show the same pattern? That's a pretty tightly correlated bundle we've got here. And these words are about different things. So it's unlikely that they'd be so tightly correlated simply because they're talking about the same things. But they are all coming from the same worldview. These are all concepts that are core to yellow stage. And they all take off in the 80s to early 90s, which is also the advent of the internet, a major yellow stage innovation. I believe that we have just uncovered exactly when global human culture started shifting into yellow stage. However, as I mentioned before, the onset of a stage isn't always perfectly clean. Here is a different set of yellow stage words. demonstrating that some yellow stage influences began to emerge in the late 19th and early 20th century, before being stomped out by the harsh conditions of the Great Depression from 1929 to 1939, and World War II from 1939 to 1945, and then pushed even further underground by the repressive cultural ambiance of the worst of the Cold War until about the mid-1980s, when finally these early yellow stage influences re-emerge in the late 80s and early 90s, now joined by the brand new yellow stage influences that we looked at previously. And now, because I suffer from hubris, I'm going to see just how far I can stretch this method. But I want you to keep the ragged starts to yellow stage and orange stage in mind as we look at the potential beginnings of turquoise and coral. For both turquoise and coral stages, I need to loosen my standards a bit for what I consider to be a neologism and a clear steep increase in a graph in order to have enough data left to look at. This indicates to me right at the outset that both of these stages are still in early days. These are the core words from the biggest cluster I found for turquoise stage. Magic, the hyphenated morpheme socio, sense, used as a verb, non-corporeal, cosmopolitanism, and eco-village. Looks like the tipping point is 90s. So it's pretty clear that turquoise stage has begun to take off already, and within only a decade of yellow stage's tipping point. And now, bum bum bum, coral stage. These are the core phrases from the biggest cluster I found for coral. My inner, liminal spaces, the verb heal applied to the direct object trauma. This arrow notation allows for the inclusion of combinations like heal the trauma, heal their trauma, heal emotional trauma, heal interpersonal trauma, etc. The verb face applied to the direct object fears. Again, this notation allows combinations like face your fears, face my fears, face those fears, etc. Self-guided and nonlinear time. And there does appear to be a tipping point in the 90s to early 2000s. The difference between the tipping point time ranges for turquoise and coral appear to be minimal, maybe a few years. And because I know some of you are going to ask, yes, I did try to keep going and do this with teal/violet stage, but I honestly had a very hard time getting a good brainstorm of words for it to begin with. So that tells me either teal stage hasn't been present enough yet to develop its own signature words and phrases, and therefore definitely hasn't reached its tipping point, or I personally don't know teal stage well enough yet to be able to brainstorm words for it, or teal stage just doesn't lend itself well to having its own words and phrases. In any case, this appears to be the limit of my current ability to utilize this model. So, are you excited to see these stages come on one right after the other, all together in one graph? Let's pick one representative word or phrase from each. Blue, church with a capital C. Orange, improvement. Green, environmental. Yellow, theory of everything. Turquoise, eco-village, coral, nonlinear time. I made a graph ahead of time and downloaded it so I could change the colors to match the stages. We're not going to see the onset of blue stage here, but I wanted to show a word that demonstrates blue stage so we could see it for context. Here's orange stage, picking up in the early 18th century, and here's green stage, lifting off roughly 2.5 centuries later in the 1960s. And here's the onset of yellow stage, only a couple of decades later, and then turquoise stage about a decade after that, and finally coral stage beginning to pick up right on the heels of turquoise stage. But here I do think it's finally worth noting the multipliers I used to make these graphs all the same height. Blue, orange, and green are all more or less in the same range. These yellow, turquoise, and coral graphs are in reality much smaller. But I didn't happen to pick the most popular words from these stages, so let's look at some of the more popular words and see how their magnitudes compare. I'll keep environmental for green stage to have something to compare with. For yellow, green, and coral, this time let's use sustainability, sense as a verb, and my inner, respectively. These are some of the more popular words from these stages, and you can see that they're still significantly smaller than the green stage word. So what this indicates to me is that although, yes, we may have hit their tipping points, we're really looking at the beginnings of these stages. Let's do a quick test to see if we can estimate roughly where we might be with respect to these tipping points. Please keep in mind that what we're going to be trying here is only a very rough estimate, since different individual words, even within the same stage, have differently shaped graphs and varying degrees of popularity. At the year 2022, which is the latest data that Ngram Viewer currently provides, sustainability for yellow stage was at 0.0019% frequency. I'm rounding. Sense for turquoise stage was at 0.0009% frequency, and my inner for coral stage was at 0.0001% frequency. So let's look at the progression of the green word to compare. Environmental was at 0.00018% frequency in 1966. So that would indicate that 2022 for yellow stage was approximately equivalent to 1966 for green stage. Think about what the mid to late 60s were like for green stage. This analysis is indicating that's about where we're at right now for yellow stage. As of the making of this video, we're in 2025. And then environmental was at 0.0009% frequency in 1958. So that would mean that 2022 for turquoise stage was approximately equivalent to 1958 for green stage. For context, 1958 was the year that the pejorative term beatnik was coined. For coral stage, let's compare it with yellow stage. So in 2022, my inner for coral stage was at 0.0001% frequency. Sustainability for yellow stage was that at that level of frequency in 1988. So that indicates that 2022 for coral stage was roughly equivalent to the late 80s for yellow stage. For context, the late 80s was when the World Wide Web was invented. So yes, it looks like humanity has already reached the cultural tipping point into Tier 2. The revolution is here, right now, and we're right at ground zero.